It was one of those nights when everything seemed to go sideways from the very beginning. Detective Lisa Rodriguez had been on the force for 8 years, and she thought she'd seen it all. But this Tuesday evening in downtown Washington, D.C., was testing every bit of patience she had left. The radio had been crackling non-stop since her shift started at 6. First, there was a fender bender on Constitution Avenue that backed up traffic for miles. Then a water main burst near the Lincoln Memorial, flooding half the street and causing chaos for both tourists and locals trying to get home. By the time 9 o'clock rolled around, Lisa was already running on her third cup of coffee and wondering if the universe had something personal against her. That's when the call came in about a disturbance near the British Embassy. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio with that familiar tone of controlled frustration. Unit 47, we've got multiple complaints about someone causing a scene on Embassy Row. Caller says there's a guy in a costume refusing to move and blocking foot traffic. Lisa sighed and grabbed her radio. Unit 47 responding. What kind of costume are we talking about here? Reports say he's dressed like one of those British guards. You know, the ones with the big fuzzy hats, red uniform, the whole thing. Been standing there for hours apparently, and people are getting upset. Great, Lisa thought. Another street performer who didn't know when to quit. DC was full of them, especially around the tourist areas. Most were harmless enough, but every now and then you'd get someone who took their act too seriously or refused to follow the basic rules about public spaces. She pulled up to the embassy area and immediately saw what the fuss was about. There was definitely a crowd gathering, maybe 20 or 30 people, all focused on something near the embassy's front entrance. As she got closer, she could see exactly what had everyone's attention. Standing perfectly straight and completely still was a man in the most elaborate military uniform she'd ever seen in person. The red jacket was pristine, with gold braiding and buttons that caught the streetlight. His black pants had a sharp crease that looked like it could cut glass, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine. On his head sat the famous tall black hat she'd seen in movies and documentaries about British royalty. But what struck Lisa most was how absolutely motionless he was. Not just standing still, but frozen like a statue. His eyes stared straight ahead, not tracking the movement of people around him. His hands were positioned exactly at his sides, and she couldn't even see his chest moving as he breathed. The crowd around him was a mix of curious tourists and increasingly frustrated locals. Some people were taking pictures, holding up their phones to get the perfect shot. Others were trying to get his attention, waving hands in front of his face or calling out questions. A few teenagers were getting bold, making jokes and trying to get him to crack a smile. "Hey buddy, you okay in there?" one young man called out, snapping his fingers near the guard's ear. Nothing. Not even a blink. An older woman with a thick southern accent was getting more agitated by the minute. "This is ridiculous," she announced to anyone who would listen. "I've been trying to walk down the sidewalk for 10 minutes, and this character won't move an inch. I asked him politely to step aside, and he just ignores me like I'm not even here." Lisa approached the group, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her radio. Years of experience had taught her to read crowds, and this one was starting to shift from curious to annoyed. That's usually when things got complicated. "Excuse me, folks," she called out, using her most authoritative voice. "Police. I'm going to need everyone to step back and give me some room here." The crowd reluctantly moved back a few feet, but Lisa could feel their eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do. She walked up to the motionless figure and took a good look at him. Up close, the uniform was even more impressive. Every detail was perfect, from the spacing of the buttons to the way the fabric lay without a single wrinkle. This wasn't some cheap costume from a party store. This was professional grade. "Sir," Lisa said in a clear, professional tone, "I'm Detective Rodriguez with the Metropolitan Police. I need to speak with you." Nothing. The man's eyes remained fixed on some invisible point in the distance. His expression didn't change by even the smallest degree. Lisa tried again, this time moving directly into his line of sight. "Sir, I'm going to need you to respond when I'm speaking to you. We've had complaints about you blocking pedestrian traffic." Still nothing. It was like talking to a mannequin. except mannequins didn't usually look this real or this perfectly positioned. Behind her, the crowd was getting restless again. Someone called out, "Just arrest him already." Another voice added, "Yeah, he's obviously on something. Look at him, he's not even human." Lisa felt the pressure building. In situations like this, you had to make a decision and stick with it. The longer you waited, the more the crowd would lose confidence in your ability to handle the situation. And a crowd that lost confidence in the police could quickly become a crowd that created bigger problems. She pulled out her radio and called for backup. Unit 47 requesting additional units at the British Embassy. "I've got an unresponsive individual who may be under the influence or experiencing a medical emergency." The dispatcher confirmed backup was on the way, but Lisa knew it would be at least 10 minutes before anyone else arrived. Traffic was still a nightmare from the earlier incidents, and all available units were spread thin across the city. She turned back to the motionless figure and tried a different approach. Maybe he was having some kind of medical episode. She'd seen people freeze up during seizures or diabetic emergencies. It would explain the complete lack of response to any stimuli. "Sir, are you okay? Are you having a medical emergency? If you can hear me, I need you to blink or give me some kind of sign." The man's eyes remained fixed and glassy. His breathing was so shallow that Lisa had to look closely to see any movement at all. For a moment, she wondered if he might actually be having a serious medical crisis. That's when she made the decision that would change everything. Following department protocol for dealing with individuals who were unresponsive and potentially in medical distress, Lisa reached for her handcuffs. "Sir, I'm going to place you in protective custody until we can determine your condition and get you medical attention if needed." As she gently took hold of his arm, she was surprised by how solid and strong he felt. This wasn't someone who was weak or collapsing. His muscles were tense and ready, like a coiled spring. But still, he didn't react as she carefully positioned his hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs closing seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly quiet crowd. For a split second, Lisa felt like she just made a terrible mistake, though she couldn't explain why. That feeling was about to become very, very justified. The embassy doors, which had been closed throughout the entire incident, suddenly swung open with a force that made everyone turn to look. What emerged was a figure that made Lisa's heart sink straight into her stomach. Another man in military uniform strode out, but this one was clearly an officer. His uniform was different, more elaborate, with additional insignia and decorations that spoke of rank and authority. His face was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and barely controlled anger. The crowd fell completely silent as this new figure approached, his boots clicking sharply on the pavement with each measured step. Lisa felt every eye in the crowd turn from her to him and back again, sensing that something very important was about to happen. And in that moment, as the officer's eyes met hers across the short distance between them, Lisa realized that her long, difficult night was about to become something much, much worse. The officer walking toward Lisa moved with the kind of precision that only came from years of military training. Each step was deliberate, controlled, and somehow managed to convey both authority and barely restrained fury at the same time. The crowd, which had been buzzing with excitement just moments before, fell into an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Lisa felt her mouth go dry as she watched him approach. Something about his bearing, the way he held himself, the crisp perfection of his uniform, told her that this wasn't just another street performer or embassy security guard. This was someone important, someone who commanded respect, and someone who was definitely not happy about what he was seeing. The officer stopped about 3 feet away from her, his eyes moving from Lisa's face to the handcuffed figure behind her, then back again. When he spoke, his voice carried a British accent that was unmistakably authoritative, the kind of voice that was used to giving orders and having them followed without question. "Detective," he said, and somehow, he managed to pack a world of disapproval into that single word. "I am Captain Morrison of Her Majesty's Royal Guard. Would you mind explaining to me why you have placed one of my men in handcuffs?" Lisa felt like the ground had just shifted beneath her feet. One of his men? She glanced back at the motionless figure, then at Captain Morrison, trying to process what she was hearing. "Your men, sir? I'm afraid I don't understand." This individual was reported as causing a disturbance, and when I tried to question him, he was completely unresponsive. I was concerned he might be having a medical emergency. Captain Morrison's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he was fighting very hard to remain professional. "Detective, the man you have in custody is Guardsman Chen, a serving member of the Queen's Guard. He is performing his official duties as a ceremonial sentry, and he has been doing exactly what he was ordered to do." The words hit Lisa like a physical blow. A real guard, an actual, honest-to-goodness British Royal Guard, and she had just arrested him for doing his job. She felt her face flush with embarrassment and something close to panic as the full weight of her mistake began to sink in. "But sir," she said, her voice sounding smaller than she intended, "he wouldn't respond to me at all. I spoke to him several times, identified myself as police, and he acted like I wasn't even there. I thought he might be under the influence of something or having some kind of medical crisis." Captain Morrison nodded slowly, and for the first time, his expression softened just slightly. "Detective, these men are trained from their very first day of service to maintain their post and bearing regardless of any external circumstances. When Guardsman Chen took his position this evening, his orders were explicit and non-negotiable: remain at attention and do not break character or position for any reason short of a direct threat to life." Lisa stared at him, trying to wrap her head around what she was hearing. "You mean he couldn't respond to me, even when I identified myself as police?" "He was torn between two duties," Morrison explained, his voice taking on a slightly more understanding tone: respect for law enforcement and his sworn obligation to his ceremonial post. His training dictated that he maintain his position. Breaking character while on ceremonial duty would be considered a serious breach of military discipline. The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the drama unfolding before them. Lisa could hear whispers and murmurs as people tried to understand what was happening. Someone behind her said, "Is that a real British soldier?" Another voice answered, "Looks like the cop didn't know either." Lisa felt mortified. In 8 years on the force, she'd made her share of mistakes, but nothing quite like this. She'd arrested a foreign military serviceman who was literally just doing his job. The implications of that were starting to hit her, and none of them were good. "Sir," she said, reaching for her keys, "I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Let me get these cuffs off him right away." "Wait," Morrison said, holding up a hand. "Before you do that, I think this might be a good opportunity for everyone here to learn something important." He turned to address the crowd, which had grown to include not just curious tourists, but also a few other police officers who had arrived as backup, several embassy staff members who had emerged from the building, and even some local residents who had been drawn by the commotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison said, his voice carrying easily across the gathered group, "what you're witnessing here is actually a perfect example of how misunderstandings can occur between different cultures and traditions, even when everyone involved is trying to do the right thing." He gestured toward the still motionless Guardsman Chen. "This man has been standing in that exact position for over 2 hours. During that time, he has not moved, spoken, or acknowledged anyone around him. Not because he's rude, not because he's on drugs, and not because he's having a medical emergency, but because that is exactly what his duty requires of him." Lisa listened, fascinated despite her embarrassment. She'd seen documentaries about the guards at Buckingham Palace, but she'd never really thought about what kind of training and discipline it must take to actually do that job. Morrison continued, "These guards are trained to withstand incredible distractions while maintaining their posts. They've stood through thunderstorms, endured tourists trying to make them laugh, ignored protesters shouting in their faces, and maintained their positions, even when insects land on them, or birds nest in their helmets." One of the tourists, a middle-aged man with a camera around his neck, called out, "But surely they'd respond to police, right? I mean, if there was a real emergency?" "That's an excellent question," Morrison replied. "The answer is that they are trained to assess threats and respond appropriately while still maintaining their ceremonial duties. If Detective Rodriguez had been responding to an actual emergency that threatened public safety, Guardsman Chen would have broken his stance to assist. But absent such a threat, his orders require him to maintain position. Lisa found herself asking, how do they do it? I mean, how do you train someone to ignore everything around them like that? Morrison smiled for the first time since he'd appeared. It's not about ignoring, Detective. It's about focus and discipline. These men undergo months of training that teaches them to be aware of everything happening around them while still maintaining their ceremonial role. Guardsman Chen was aware of every word you spoke, every person in this crowd, and every movement around him. He simply couldn't respond without violating his orders. As if to prove the point, Morrison walked over to his guardsman and spoke quietly near his ear. Guardsman Chen, you are temporarily relieved of ceremonial duties for debrief. The change was immediate and startling. Chen's rigid posture relaxed slightly, his eyes focused and moved to track the people around him, and he took what was clearly his first deep breath in hours. But even relieved of duty, he maintained perfect military bearing. Sir, Chen said to his captain, his voice crisp and clear, request permission to address the detective. Morrison nodded. Permission granted. Chen turned to face Lisa directly, and she was struck by how young he looked now that his face showed expression. He couldn't have been more than 25, with kind eyes and an earnest expression. Detective Rodriguez, he said, I want you to know that no offense was taken. You were doing your job, investigating what appeared to be an unusual situation. I could hear everything you said, and I understood your concern. I was actually grateful that someone was paying attention to public safety. Lisa felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by professional curiosity. Can I ask you something? What was going through your mind when I put the handcuffs on you? Chen smiled slightly. Honestly, I was hoping my captain would come out soon, because I really needed to use the restroom. The crowd burst into laughter, and Lisa found herself laughing too. The tension that had been building for the past several minutes suddenly broke, replaced by something that felt more like mutual understanding and respect. The laughter that followed Chen's honest comment about needing the restroom seemed to break down the last barriers between everyone gathered on the sidewalk. What had started as a tense confrontation was transforming into something completely different. Lisa could feel the shift in the crowd's energy, from hostile curiosity to genuine interest in learning more about what they'd just witnessed. Captain Morrison seemed to sense this change too, and instead of immediately escorting his guardsman back into the embassy, he made a decision that would turn this embarrassing incident into something much more valuable. You know what, Morrison said, addressing the crowd that had grown to include nearly 50 people, since we're all here, and since this situation has given us an unexpected opportunity, why don't I tell you a bit more about what these guards actually do, and why this tradition exists? Lisa found herself nodding eagerly. Her initial embarrassment was giving way to professional curiosity. In all her years as a police officer, she'd never had a chance to learn about military traditions from other countries, especially not from someone who clearly lived and breathed this stuff every day. First, Morrison continued, let me explain why Guardsman Chen is here in Washington at all. He's part of a cultural exchange program between the British and American militaries. Every few months, we send guards to serve at our embassy here, as part of ceremonies that celebrate the friendship between our two countries. An elderly woman in the crowd raised her hand like she was in school. How long do they have to stand like that? I've been watching for almost an hour, and he never moved once. Morrison smiled at the question. The standard ceremonial duty shift is 2 hours, though in extreme weather conditions, we sometimes shorten it to prevent heat exhaustion or frostbite. But under normal circumstances, like tonight, they're expected to maintain their position for the full 2 hours without any breaks. 2 hours? Lisa said, genuinely amazed. How is that even physically possible? I mean, I get tired just standing around at crime scenes for 20 minutes. That's an excellent question, Detective, Morrison replied. The training these men go through is incredibly rigorous, both physically and mentally. It starts with basic fitness requirements that are far beyond what most people could achieve. But the physical part is actually the easier aspect to master. He gestured toward Chen, who was still standing at attention, but now appeared more relaxed and human. The mental training is what really sets these guards apart. They learn techniques for dealing with discomfort, boredom, the distractions, and even pain while maintaining perfect composure. A young man in the crowd called out, "What kind of distractions are we talking about? Like, what's the worst thing that's ever happened to one of these guys while they were on duty?" Morrison chuckled. "Oh, where do I begin? I've seen guards maintain their posts while tourists tried everything imaginable to get a reaction. People have told jokes, made faces, even done impromptu dance performances right in front of them. I once watched a guard stand perfectly still while a pigeon built a nest in the decorative plume of his helmet." The crowd laughed, but Morrison's expression grew more serious. "But it's not all harmless fun. These men also have to deal with people who are genuinely trying to cause problems. I've seen protesters scream obscenities inches from a guard's face for hours at a time. I've watched people try to physically intimidate them, throw things at them, or even attempt to provoke them into breaking character." Lisa felt a new respect growing for what these guards endured. How do they handle that psychologically? I mean, having people intentionally trying to mess with you while you can't respond has got to be incredibly frustrating. "That's where the real training comes in," Morrison explained. "These men learn to view their duty from a completely different perspective. They're not just standing guard. They're representing something much larger than themselves. They're living symbols of discipline, tradition, and service to something greater than their own comfort or convenience." He turned to address Chen directly. "Guardsman, would you mind sharing with these folks what goes through your mind during a long ceremonial duty?" Chen straightened up even more, if that was possible. "Yes, sir. When I take my post, I'm not thinking about time passing or physical discomfort. I'm thinking about the history of the unit I represent, the generations of guards who stood these same posts before me, and the honor of carrying on that tradition." A teenager in the crowd looked skeptical. "Come on, that sounds like something from a movie. You're telling me you never get bored or want to check your phone or anything normal like that?" Chen's face broke into a genuine smile. "Of course, I'm human. My feet hurt, I get tired, and yes, sometimes I think about other things. But the training teaches you to acknowledge those feelings without letting them control your actions. It's similar to what athletes do when they push through pain to achieve their goals, or what your police officers do when they stay focused during dangerous situations despite being afraid." Lisa found herself nodding at that comparison. She'd definitely been in situations where her training had to override her natural human reactions. That actually makes a lot of sense. We learn to stay calm and professional even when everything inside us is screaming to do something else. "Exactly," Morrison said. "The difference is that our ceremonial duties require us to demonstrate that discipline visibly, for extended periods, while dealing with the additional challenge of public scrutiny." An older gentleman who'd been listening quietly spoke up. "I fought in Vietnam, and I've got to say, this is impressive. But what happens if there's a real emergency? Like, what if someone had a heart attack right in front of the guard?" Morrison's expression became very serious. "That's an excellent question, and it touches on something important. These guards are not robots. They are trained soldiers who are fully capable of assessing situations and responding appropriately. If there were a genuine emergency, someone having a medical crisis, a security threat, or any situation where immediate action could save lives, the guard would absolutely break from his ceremonial stance to help." Chen nodded in agreement. "We're taught to distinguish between normal distractions and actual emergencies. If that elderly lady earlier had collapsed, instead of just asking me to move, I would have immediately called for medical assistance and provided aid if I was trained to do so." "So, how do you make that distinction?" Lisa asked. "I mean, how do you decide what's worth breaking your stance for?" "Training and experience," Morrison replied. "But the general rule is simple. If someone's life or safety is genuinely at risk, ceremony takes a back seat to human welfare. These traditions are important, but they're not more important than human life. This led to more questions from the crowd. People wanted to know about the history of the uniforms, the significance of different decorations, and how someone becomes a royal guard in the first place. Morrison and Chen patiently answered each question, clearly enjoying the opportunity to share their knowledge with people who were genuinely interested. Lisa found herself completely absorbed in the conversation. She learned that the tall black hats, called bearskins, were made from the fur of Canadian black bears and could weigh up to 2 pounds. She discovered that the red uniforms weren't just for show, they had practical origins in helping commanders spot their troops on smoky battlefields centuries ago. The brass buttons alone tell a story, Morrison explained, pointing to the intricate designs on Chen's uniform. Each one represents different battles, victories, and honors earned by the regiment over hundreds of years of service. As the impromptu lesson continued, Lisa noticed something remarkable happening. The crowd, which had started out frustrated and slightly hostile, had transformed into an engaged audience. People were asking thoughtful questions, sharing their own military experiences, and expressing genuine appreciation for what they were learning. A young mother with 2 small children approached Chen carefully. "Would it be okay if my kids asked you some questions? They've never seen a real soldier before, and this is pretty amazing for them." Chen knelt down to the children's level, his formal military bearing softening into something warmer, but still dignified. "Of course. What would you like to know?" The interaction that followed was one of the most touching things Lisa had witnessed in a long time. The children asked innocent questions about his uniform, whether he ever got scared, and if he liked being a soldier. Chen answered each question with patience and kindness, explaining things in terms the kids could understand. By the time the conversation began to wind down, Lisa realized that what had started as one of the most embarrassing moments of her career had turned into one of the most educational and meaningful experiences she'd had in years. As the evening continued and the crowd began to thin out, Lisa found herself staying behind when she could have easily returned to her patrol duties. Something about this whole experience had grabbed her attention in a way that went beyond professional curiosity. She'd spent 8 years as a police officer thinking she understood duty and service, but watching Chen and listening to Morrison had shown her there were depths to these concepts she'd never considered. "Captain Morrison," she said, as the last of the tourists wandered away, "I have to ask you something that's been bothering me. Aren't you angry about what happened? I mean, I arrested one of your men for doing his job. If someone did that to one of my officers, I'd probably be filing complaints and demanding meetings with supervisors." Morrison looked at her thoughtfully for a moment before answering. "Detective, can I ask you something first? When you approached Guardsman Chen tonight, what was going through your mind?" Lisa considered the question seriously. "Honestly, I was thinking about public safety. I had multiple complaints about someone who appeared to be causing a disturbance, and when I tried to communicate with him, he was completely unresponsive. In my training and experience, that usually means one of 3 things: medical emergency, drug impairment, or mental health crisis. All of those scenarios require immediate intervention." "Exactly," Morrison said with a slight smile. "You were doing your job, just as Chen was doing his. The problem wasn't that either of you did anything wrong. The problem was that neither of you had the information you needed to understand what the other was doing." Chen, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. "Detective, if I may say so, I was actually impressed by how professionally you handled the situation. You identified yourself clearly, explained what you were doing, and when I didn't respond, you followed proper procedure for someone who might be in distress." Lisa felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, but she still felt the weight of her mistake. "That's kind of you to say, but I still arrested an innocent man who was just trying to do his duty. And that," Morrison said, "is exactly why I'm not angry, because this whole situation has shown me something important that I hadn't fully appreciated before tonight." He gestured toward the embassy building behind them. "We come here as part of this cultural exchange program, and we focus on the ceremony, the tradition, the formal aspects of what we do. but we don't spend nearly enough time thinking about how our presence affects the local community or how local law enforcement might interact with our activities. Lisa was intrigued. What do you mean? Think about it from your perspective, Morrison continued. You're a police officer in Washington, D.C. You deal with street performers, protesters, people having mental health crises, and all sorts of situations involving people in unusual clothing or behaving in unexpected ways. Then suddenly, there's a man in a military uniform standing perfectly still for hours, and nobody told you he was supposed to be there or what he was doing. The truth of that statement hit Lisa, a revelation. You're right. If I'd known he was there officially, if there had been some kind of communication between the embassy and local police, this whole thing could have been avoided. Exactly, Morrison said. And that's not your fault or Chen's fault. That's a failure in our planning and coordination. Chen nodded in agreement. I've been thinking about this too, sir. When I took my post tonight, I was focused entirely on my ceremonial duties, but I didn't consider how my presence might look to someone who wasn't familiar with our traditions or expecting to see a British guard in Washington, D.C. Lisa found herself getting excited about an idea that was forming in her mind. What if we could fix that? I mean, what if there was a way to prevent this kind of misunderstanding from happening again? Morrison raised an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? Well, Lisa said, her words coming faster as she thought it through. What if we set up better communication between the embassy and local law enforcement when you're planning ceremonial events? And what if we could educate officers about different cultural and military traditions they might encounter in D.C.? She turned to Chen. And what if guards had some kind of discreet way to signal to law enforcement if there was a real problem, without breaking their ceremonial stance? Morrison's eyes lit up with interest. Those are actually excellent suggestions, Detective. We deal with American law enforcement fairly regularly, but it's usually at a much higher level, through official, diplomatic channels. We don't often think about the day-to-day interactions that street-level officers might need to navigate. Chen was nodding enthusiastically. And honestly, sir, it would be helpful for us to understand American police procedures better too. I knew Detective Rodriguez was trying to do her job, but I didn't fully understand what her protocols required or why my lack of response might have seemed like a red flag to her. Lisa felt a surge of excitement. This could actually work. You know what? I think I might be able to make some of this happen. Our department does regular training sessions on community policing and cultural awareness. We could definitely include a section on diplomatic and military traditions. And, Morrison added, we could arrange for some of our guards to participate in those training sessions, to help officers understand what they might encounter and how to handle it appropriately. The three of them spent the next 20 minutes discussing practical details. Morrison explained that the embassy typically hosted ceremonial events about once a month, and that they could easily provide advance notice to the local police department. Lisa talked about the training programs already in place, and how they could be expanded to include this kind of cultural education. Chen had some particularly insightful suggestions about non-verbal communication. What if guards had a subtle hand signal they could use to indicate they're performing official duties? He proposed something that wouldn't break the ceremonial appearance, but would let law enforcement know the situation is normal. That's brilliant, Lisa said. We could include that in the training, so officers would know what to look for. As they talked, Lisa realized that something much more significant was happening than just planning better procedures. The three of them, who had started the evening as strangers involved in a tense misunderstanding, were becoming genuinely collaborative partners in solving a real problem. Morrison seemed to sense this too. You know, Detective, this conversation has been more valuable than any official diplomatic meeting attended in years. We're actually talking about practical solutions to real-world problems, not just exchanging polite formalities. I agree, Lisa said, and honestly, I'm learning more about duty and service from you too than I have in years of police training. The dedication it takes to stand motionless for 2 hours while people try to distract you, or to maintain perfect discipline, even when you're being arrested for doing your job. That's a level of commitment that I find really inspiring. Chen looked slightly embarrassed by the praise. Detective, if I may say so, what you do every day is just as impressive. You go out on patrol never knowing what kind of situation you'll encounter, dealing with people who might be hostile or dangerous, and you do it to protect people you've never met. That takes a different kind of courage, but it's just as real. The mutual respect that was developing between them was obvious, and Lisa found herself thinking about how rarely she had opportunities like this to really connect with people from such different backgrounds who were still dedicated to similar ideals of service. Morrison looked at his watch and sighed. I'm afraid I need to get Guardsman Chen back inside soon. He's been off duty for over an hour now, and he needs time to properly decompress and prepare for his next shift. Lisa felt disappointed that the conversation was ending, but she also felt energized by everything they discussed. Before you go, can I ask you both something? Would you be willing to come speak to my department about what we've talked about tonight? Not in any official capacity, just as part of our ongoing community education efforts. Both men looked genuinely pleased by the invitation. I think that would be excellent, Morrison said. And Detective, would you be interested in visiting the embassy sometime? We could give you a proper tour and show you more about our traditions and procedures. I would love that, Lisa replied immediately. As they prepared to part ways, Chen extended his hand to shake Lisa's. Detective Rodriguez, thank you for tonight. I know it didn't start the way any of us planned, but I think we've all learned something valuable. Lisa shook his hand warmly. Thank you both. And Chen, I have to say, if I ever need someone to watch my back in a tough situation, I'd be honored to have someone with your level of discipline and dedication standing with me. Morrison smiled at the exchange. Detective, I think this is the beginning of a very positive relationship between our organizations. 3 weeks later, Lisa walked into the main conference room at the Metropolitan Police Department headquarters with a mix of excitement and nervousness she hadn't felt since her first day on the force. Today was the day she'd been working toward since that unexpected encounter outside the British Embassy, and she wasn't entirely sure how her fellow officers would react to what she had planned. The room was filling up with about 30 officers from various departments, all looking slightly curious about this mandatory training session on international cultural awareness and diplomatic protocols. Most of them probably expected another boring lecture about sensitivity and political correctness, the kind of thing that made cops roll their eyes and check their phones. Lisa had felt the same way about these sessions before her experience with Chen and Morrison, but now she understood that this wasn't about political correctness at all. This was about being better at their jobs and avoiding the kind of embarrassing mistakes that could damage relationships between their department and the international community that called Washington, D.C. home. Good morning, everyone, Lisa said as she stepped to the front of the room. I know you're all wondering why you're here instead of out on patrol, so let me start by telling you about something that happened to me a few weeks ago that changed how I think about our work. She began telling the story of that Tuesday night, from the initial call about a disturbance to the moment she realized she'd arrested a foreign soldier for doing his job. The room, which had started out with the usual pre-training chatter and restlessness, gradually fell silent as her colleagues listened to her account. Now, Isa continued, I could have just written this off as a weird one-time thing and moved on. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this kind of situation is probably going to become more common, not less. We've got embassies, international organizations, cultural exchange programs, and diplomatic events happening all over our city all the time. She gestured toward the back of the room, where Captain Morrison and Guardsman Chen had quietly entered and were standing in their dress uniforms. So I asked these gentlemen if they'd be willing to come here today and help us all understand what we might encounter and how to handle it better. The transformation in the room was immediate. Officers who had been slouching in their chairs sat up straighter. The few who had been discreetly checking their phones put them away. There's something about seeing real military dress uniforms that commands automatic respect, even from people who spend their days dealing with every kind of situation imaginable. Morrison stepped forward with that same confident bearing Lisa remembered from their first meeting. "Officers, thank you for having us here today. I want to start by saying that what happened with Detective Rodriguez was not a failure on anyone's part. It was simply a lack of information and communication that we're hoping to fix," he began, explaining the various types of ceremonial and diplomatic activities that regularly took place in Washington, from formal state visits to cultural celebrations to military exchange programs. Lisa watched her colleagues' faces as they realized just how many situations they might encounter that they'd never been trained to recognize or handle. Chen took over the presentation to demonstrate the nonverbal signals they developed for guards to use when they needed to communicate with law enforcement without breaking their ceremonial stance. It was fascinating to watch him switch between his rigid ceremonial posture and normal movement, showing exactly how subtle the approved signals could be. "The key thing to remember," Chen explained, "is that we're not trying to ignore you or be disrespectful. We're following orders that are just as important to us as your police protocols are to you. But now, we have ways to let you know that everything is normal without compromising our ceremonial duties." Officer Williams, a 15-year veteran who Lisa had always respected for his practical approach to policing, raised his hand. "This is all really interesting, but I have to ask the obvious question. How often are we actually going to encounter this kind of situation?" Morrison smiled at the question. "More often than you might think, officer. Just in the past year, we've had guards posted for ceremonial duties at least 12 times. The French embassy has similar traditions, as do several other diplomatic missions. There are also cultural festivals, military commemorations, and international events that bring various uniformed personnel to the city on a regular basis." Lisa could see her colleagues starting to understand that this wasn't just theoretical knowledge. This was practical information they could actually use in their daily work. The real breakthrough came when Detective Johnson, who worked in a district that included several embassies, shared his own story. "You know, I had something similar happen about 6 months ago with some ceremonial guards from the Korean embassy. I didn't arrest anyone, but I spent about an hour trying to figure out what was going on because nobody had told us they'd be there. That opened the floodgates." Other officers started sharing their own experiences with diplomatic events, cultural celebrations, and international visitors that had confused or complicated their regular duties. Lisa realized that her experience outside the British embassy wasn't unusual at all. It was just the first time someone had actually done something about it. Morrison and Chen spent the next hour answering questions, demonstrating procedures, and helping the officers understand the differences between various types of ceremonial duties and how to recognize them. They covered everything from how to tell the difference between a legitimate ceremonial guard and someone in a costume, to what kinds of situations would require a guard to break from their duties, to how to quickly verify someone's credentials through diplomatic channels. But the most powerful moment came near the end of the session when Chen did something completely unexpected. He asked for a volunteer to try standing at ceremonial attention for just 5 minutes. Officer Martinez, a rookie who'd been on the force for less than a year, volunteered. Chen positioned her properly, explained the mental techniques for maintaining focus, and then had her stand completely still while the rest of the room continued their normal conversation around her. Lisa watched Martinez's face as the minutes ticked by. At first, she looked confident, almost amused, but by the 3rd minute, she was clearly struggling. Her eyes wanted to track the movement around her, her muscles were starting to protest the rigid posture, and she was obviously fighting the urge to respond when colleagues tried to get her attention. When the 5 minutes were up, Martinez relaxed with an audible sigh. "Oh my God," she said. "That was so much harder than I thought it would be. And that was only 5 minutes. You guys do that for 2 hours?" "Sometimes longer," Chen replied with a grin. "And usually while wearing heavier uniforms, in various weather conditions, with crowds of people actively trying to distract you." The respect in the room was palpable. These were police officers who understood physical and mental toughness, but they were clearly impressed by what they just witnessed. As the training session wound down, Lisa felt a deep sense of satisfaction. What had started as her most embarrassing professional moment had turned into something that would genuinely help her colleagues do their jobs better, but the real surprise came after the session ended, when several officers approached Morrison and Chen to continue the conversation. Officer Thompson, who worked crowd control at large events, wanted to know more about how guards maintained their composure when dealing with hostile crowds. Detective Kim, who had military experience herself, ended up in a deep discussion about the differences between American and British military traditions. Captain Morrison pulled Lisa aside as the room gradually emptied. "Detective, I can't thank you enough for making this happen. This kind of face-to-face interaction in education is exactly what we needed." Chen nodded in agreement. "And I have to say, your colleagues asked really thoughtful questions. It's clear they take their responsibilities seriously, just like we do." Lisa felt proud of her department and her fellow officers. "You know what the best part is? I don't think any of us will ever look at duty and service the same way again. We've all learned something from each other." 6 months later, Lisa kept a framed photograph on her desk showing her standing next to Chen in his full ceremonial uniform, both of them smiling broadly. But more importantly, she kept a folder of thank you notes from embassy staff, cultural organizations, and international visitors who had been helped by officers who now understood their traditions and knew how to interact with them respectfully. The incident that had started as a mistake had grown into something much larger. The police department now had regular communication protocols with all the diplomatic missions in the city. Officers received updated training on international customs and ceremonial procedures, and perhaps most importantly, there was a new understanding that the diversity of their city included not just different cultures and languages, but different ways of expressing honor, duty, and service. Lisa often thought about that night when everything went wrong and somehow ended up going completely right. It had taught her that sometimes the best way to learn is through mistakes, and that the most important thing isn't avoiding errors,